Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brandon Freeme, and I'm one of the social workers here at Sonder. So, Sonder is a digitally enabled 24/7 human support wellbeing platform. We provide mental health, safety, and medical pathways for employees. To briefly introduce myself, as I mentioned, I'm a social worker. I'm also a registered nurse, and I've spent the past 10 years working as a mental health clinician in the public mental health sector across a range of clinical settings, primarily in the community, providing outreach, intervention, and support to individuals and their families navigating acute mental health episodes and crises. I've also worked with an NGO facilitating social and therapeutic group programs for people living with severe mental illness. This is a topic I'm deeply passionate about, which makes today's masterclass especially meaningful. I'm here today to play host, and I'm excited to introduce someone who shares that passion, Graeme Cowan. Graeme has dedicated much of his career to helping leaders and teams become more caring and resilient. He's a founding board director of Are You OK? And host of the Caring CEO podcast. His career includes senior roles at Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Carney. After experiencing an episode of depression, severe depression, Graeme gained powerful insights into resilience and performance, which he's shared through 4 books, including the widely acclaimed Back from the Brink. Graeme, thank you for being here today and for leading this important masterclass. Before I hand over to Graeme, I have a few housekeeping notes that I'll share with you guys. If you have any questions throughout the masterclass, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box below, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the session. If we don't get to your questions, we'll follow up with an email after the masterclass. This session is being recorded and we'll make it available afterwards to view on demand. You'll receive a link to the recording after this afternoon. With all that in mind, I'll now hand over to Graeme.
Thanks very much, Brandon. Lovely to join you and the Sonder team and all our wider audience out there. We've got over 300 people registered today, which is just fantastic. And just like Brandon, I'm really passionate about this space. I have my own lived experience, as Brandon briefly mentioned. I was working as a vice president for Carney, a management consulting company, when there was a downturn in business, and basically I crashed and burned. And I was out of work for 5 years. And at one stage, I just never, ever thought that I'd come back again. The journey was never a fast recovery. It was a combination of course, good medical care, but it was also exercise and reconnecting with family and friends. And probably a pivotal moment for me was deciding to write my first book, Back from the Brink. And that gave me a real sense of purpose, I guess. When you're depressed or in bad place yourself, you become very, very me focused. And one of the things that happens when you decide to contribute to other people is you go to a we focus. And, I think that anywhere where there's a group, where there's a team, we're always going to be much stronger together than trying to stand by myself or by yourself. I'm just going to go through a brief presentation now, which will probably take roughly about 20 minutes. And just to give a bit of, I guess, some frameworks that I really believe in and think can make a difference in the workplace. But the most important part is your questions. And as Brandon said, if you sense a question, just put it into the chat, please, and or put it into the Q&A, into the question section, and we'll have time for answering that. So we'll just launch my program. So for many reasons, there are lots and lots of issues for men. And I think there's many reasons behind that. As I said, my own experience, I'd had probably about 4 or 5 major episodes of depression. but the last one was by far the most severe. But I learned some really, I guess, important lessons personally, which I want to share. But also, a good part of my journey was meeting Gavin Larkin in 2009. And Gavin was the founding board director of, or founding the founder of Are You OK? And as soon as I heard about it and knew that the quest was to help people have conversations that could change a life, and I just think that was just a brilliant tagline, and I think it really has improved substantially since. I served for uh, I served for 13 years on the board, and this was a real highlight moment for me. About 10 years after we launched it, we actually launched this massive Are You OK program on the HMAS Adelaide in Sydney. And we had a session with all the sailors below, and then we went up and launched that. And I think one of the really important things about um, mental health and achieving change is to keep things simple, to have jargon-free advice and encourage people to follow some simple guidelines when they're not in great shape. So a few facts and figures, and this is something of which, I think it's quite astounding that 93% of work deaths are men. And, it's probably because they're in some dangerous industries like construction and mining and that sort of thing. But, it's not commonly talked about, but it is incredibly significant. And it's something that we've really got to do something about. Now, what's interesting, this was a study by the European Trade Union delegation. And what they actually looked at was psychosocial risks versus physical accidents. And they actually found that 75% of work deaths were due to harmful stress, and that was suicide and also psychosocial causes of cardiovascular disease. So, we have most organisations have a very, very high priority of physical health. They've had it for at least the last 15 years and very sophisticated. But we're still just learning about, psychosocial issues and the real harm it can bring. Now, just to give you an example of this, in the last 6 years in New South Wales, the average cost of psychosocial risk has gone from 144,000 up to over 250,000, really, really substantial. So it's a very big cause of issues in the workplace. But, there's so much hassle around, or so much momentum and embracing of physical accidents. But in fact, 75% happened from non-physical accidents. 75% of all suicides are men. And, this is something, there's many proposed reasons about that, men don't seek help easily. They don't go to see their GP as much. They also think they should be able to sort the problems out themselves. But ultimately, this is not good. And finally, and this somewhat relates to the psychosocial deaths, 80% of heart attacks under 65 are for men. So that just gives a bit of overview. But, these are statistics, but all these people are our fathers, our husbands, our partners, our sons, our uncles. And it's easily to dismiss it as not something really substantial. And I think a great way that Suicide Prevention Australia really highlighted it was in Canberra and in Parliament House by putting out 2,419 shoes. And each shoe, as you see, has got a name on it. And that's how many people died from suicide in Australia. And in terms of, the impact of that, it's just absolutely profound, the impact it has, both to the family, but also to those around them in the workplace, friends circle, broader family has a massive, massive impact. I want to, I guess, introduce something to you, a moodometer. And this came about when my um, psychiatrist would always ask me to rate my mood, 0 to 10. And one day I asked him why he did that. And what he said was that, well, it helps me to understand where you are from your perspective, and that's important. But I also believe that you should be able to learn how to manage your mood and maybe even master it. And I was a bit peeved by this. I said, haven't I got a clinical illness? And he said, yes, you do, and you'll always have a predisposition. But I believe that you and everyone else should be able to learn how to manage their mood. Now, it turns out that he was largely correct. There's a book called The How of Happiness by Professor Sonia Lyubomirsky, and she looked at over 400 peer-reviewed studies to understand what impacts our mood. And it came down to three things. The first thing is our genetics. Second thing is the events that happen to us. And the third thing is the intentional actions we take each day. So just in the chat there, I'd just love you to share what you think is the biggest contributor: genetics, events, or actions. Let's put in the chat, genetics, events, or actions. We've got actions, 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 actions. Yep, yeah, lots of actions. Yeah, yeah, very, very good. Very good. Well, in fact, the answer is genetics. And genetics contribute 50% of our mood, or what psychologists call positive affect. But I think the really hopeful part is that 40% is determined by our intentional actions, what we choose to do each day, and only 10% by events. So it's fantastic that we, know this, that there's things that we can do to keep ourselves in the green zone. And when we are in the green zone in the workplace, we're 31% more productive, 37% more influential, and 300% more creative. Huge benefits for a really rapidly changing workplace. Likewise, the red zone is really expensive, slow to recover, and we're much better investing in staying in the green zone than trying to get back from the red zone. So, what is behind the moodometer and what are the things that can impact that? I would like to discuss what's called a great leaders care mindset. And what that's made up of basically three areas: self-care, crew care or team care, or red zone care. And red zone care is identifying and support someone who's struggling. Now, if we get this right, we build our growth, we build our resilience, and we reduce risk. And this has got to be a high priority, probably the number one priority for any workplace in any area. So getting to self-care, each of those three areas, the self-care, crew care, red zone care, they could all be like a full 45-minute keynote or a whole workshop. But today we're just going to be primarily focusing on the self-care and the red zone care. I think a very, very important part is that we all share or understand a good definition of success. And I love this from Maya Angela, because, of course, it's individual to everyone. I know a lot of my stress is often comparing myself with other people and feeling lacking. But what is most important is what resonates with us, what sits well with us. So I'd just like to ask you to reflect on the last 2 weeks. And what has been most challenging for you? Has it been the uncertainty, because there's lots of uncertainty? Has it been the rate of change? Has it been not getting enough exercise, not getting enough sleep, not get or not having close contact with family and friends? So just the chat, if you would mind just nominating there what you found most challenging. And that'll help me just sort of guide the conversation as we go through this and talk further. Let me go back. So we've got quite a few there, which is got people coming in and writing about it. So yeah, just relationships, lack of work time, bereavement. Thank you for sharing that. Discipline and balance. As you can see, increased workload, family life with young children, you know, lack of a partner around, family stresses, time management. Thank you for sharing that. And as you can see, there is a lot of individual elements towards our stresses and our burnout, and some is unique to us, but others also share it very much as well. So I talk about three main classes of well-being and resilience, and this is for our own self-care. So the first one is vitality, which is our physical health. The second is intimacy, which is our emotional health. And the third one is prosperity, and this is our career health. You know, how fulfilling we find work, because work has a massive impact on our well-being. Gallup estimate they've got a book called Wellbeing, and they've broken it down into 5 different levels: physical health, financial health, um, relationship health. But the most important, and this quite surprised me, because I would have thought, physical health was, but they actually found that career health was the best predictor of overall well-being. And so, feeling that we are making a difference, feeling that we're using our strengths can make a big difference to our performance and satisfaction with our career health. So vitality. So this is moving well, exercise, and catching, exercise, a brisk walk, 40-minute, 5-minute brisk walk, or a jog, or a cycle, or whatever. But Mayo Clinic research tells us that just a 30-minute brisk walk will improve our mood for up to 12 hours later. Resting well is about getting good sleep, and also taking breaks during the day. And I really encourage people to work in pulses. So 45 minutes in a very focused manner, just working on one thing. And then when that's finished, be able to get up, walk around to recharge, take some deep breaths. And if anyone has some specific questions about that, we'll certainly very happy to cover that in the Q&A at the end. So yeah, any questions you think about, please put there. The other component for vitality is, of course, eating well. And there's a lot of study, a lot of research now that shows that people who have a whole foods diet versus a processed food diet have a much less impact of mental illness. And intimacy, the longest wellbeing study ever done is something called the Harvard Adult Development Study. And it started back in 1929 and followed the same people for over 80 years until they all passed away. Now they're following their offspring. So they have terabytes of information on what makes a good life. And there's a book of the same name that covers this as well. But through that terabytes of information, there is one overwhelming finding, and that is those that have caring and supportive relationships live longer, have lower stress, have longer sex lives. They just have a much, much better life. And so actually making a priority of relationships is essential. I call this having a care crew. And, I worked with Ted at Johnson & Johnson about 25 years ago, but we still are great friends, and we catch up usually once a month and go on a long walk. This is the walk from Cowan to Brooklyn in just north of Sydney. And it showed, this is something that before my breakdown, I didn't put enough profile and focus on this. But since then, I really invest. I've got a number of male friends, and we catch up regularly, usually walking, because it's a good thing to do, walking shoulder to shoulder. But we talk about everything, of course, the funny stuff, families, finances, career problems, etc., etc. And those of you that have a good friend where you do this regularly will know the benefit of this. And these are the three questions you should consider when you think about who could be my care crew, who could be my green zone crew that keep me in the green zone. So when you look at those questions, who do you think of? Who do you think of? And then I'd suggest or ask that, you think, do I see them enough? Do I see them enough? The last one is prosperity. And this is our career program. And there's three elements to this that I think are critical. The first thing is being able to have a personal purpose. You may be familiar with Viktor Frankl, the extraordinary psychiatrist who was imprisoned in Auschwitz and other concentration camps, wrote a book after it came out called Man's Search for Meaning. And he found that those that had a strong purpose and sense of meaning, whatever it was, whether it was family or playing the piano or whatever, it really, really helped. And one of his first things was deciding to write this book after he got out, and he wrote this book in a week. It's only an afternoon's read, Man's Search for Meaning. I often, in my workshops, take people through a process where they actually can write out the first draft of their purpose, which it's very, very empowering when you do that. So I say my purpose is I help leaders and teams to be more caring and resilient and enjoy growing together. And whenever I'm having a tough time, I remind myself of that and say, well, let's get on with it. So vitality, intimacy, prosperity, and you might notice that the acronym for that is VIP. And so it's my invitation to you to act like a VIP. And that doesn't mean acting like a wanker. It means topping up each of those three glasses every day, because we can't just work on one and not the other. We need all three. So this would be a letter to my 20-year-old self, having gone through 5 or 6 major episodes of depression. And I was striving, for success. I really was. And if things happened which clashed with, family or other things, I often let those well-being things go. And I learned the hard way that if you do that, it leads to burnout or failure. The myth of the self-made man, men are socialized to be problem solvers. They think they should be able to work it out themselves, but it's just ridiculous. And, as I said, I've worked a long time on this, but whenever I have a problem or feel real anxiety going on, I can call a mate or my wife and just talk about what's happening and get their perspective. And you share what's going on, and it halves the size of the problem. Relationships are our real wealth in every sense. And I shared before the Harvard study, the longest study, that investing time in relationships is good for all elements of our well-being. And start your VIP habits now. The vitality, the intimacy, prosperity, because they act like a vaccine or inoculation to tougher times. So this is just a moodometer, which I talk about, and there are just, we can have ourselves in the green, amber, and red zone, and it's a different approach or step forward depending on what zone you're on. And if you'd like me to send a copy of that to you, you can please reach out via LinkedIn. I'm very active there, so invite me there, and I'm very happy to share this and some other tools. The red zone, as I said, it's not much fun being in the red zone. And when you're in it and been in it for a while, like I was, you just think that recovery isn't possible. And I was 120% convinced that I wouldn't recover. So this is one of my books, Back from the Brink. And as part of that, I surveyed over 4,000 people to find out what worked best in their recovery. And so it's the acronym ICARE. So I is for identify, knowing the signs that people could be struggling. And, I just ask people to, I know that you will have people in your life who are struggling, men in your life and women in your life. How do you know when they're struggling? Just put a quick note in the chat about how you can tell if someone is struggling. Withdrawal, they go quiet, isolate, stressed out family, high workload, baby on the way, wow, poor sleep quality, yeah, family issues. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It is, and it is changes, whether it's changes in behavior, changes in mood, changes in how they present themselves and dressing, but they all make a big, big difference. I also have a poster that talks through, it's just a one page post that talks through all those four areas. So compassion is asking, are you okay with empathy? Access expert is encouraging them to seek expert help to find a mental health savvy GP. R is for revitalizing work, which tells us that the recovery research tells us that in most situations, the majority, people are better off being connected with their workmates than being by themselves. There's exceptions to that, of course, but in most cases, that's the situation. And then E is for exercise. And we already shared the benefits of, a fast walk and moving through that. There's some really good male groups out there now. The Men's Shed is probably the best known, and they have 3,000 men's sheds now around Australia. And you just hear lots and lots of stories how people are standing shoulder to shoulder, working on something physical with their hands, but in that shoulder to shoulder, great things happen. People do share what's going on. These are some others: mentoring men, the men's table. Dads in Distress is particularly directed towards men whose marriage has broken down, going through divorce, going through child separation issues. And again, they're all peers, led by peers that are committed to helping you. So, what needs to be done for genuine workplace change? I think one of the big things is encourage male leaders to share their story. Their story is absolutely contagious. When we share our stories, as I've done many times, people feel comfortable to share their stories, and there's nothing better for real change to see a senior leader be vulnerable. Like I've seen a leader um, talking to, about 300 managers, talking about the time he was homeless and living in his car. I've heard a leader, Chris Murray, who's the CEO of Energy Power, talk about losing three mates to suicide and how devastating that was. Those stories help, and pretending isn't going on doesn't work. Here's a really good one. In your weekly meeting, ask people if they're in the amber or green zone. And, I don't put red zone there because there still is a fair bit of stigma around that and people admitting they're there. But if someone's in the amber zone, hopefully it's a signal for all of us to, make some contact with that person during the week. Managers walk the wellbeing talk. The American Psychological Association showed that when a manager walks the talk, it triples the motivation and sense of purpose for those other people in the group. What you do has much more impact than what you say. And strive to create a caring and resilient team, and make it safe to say no, I'm not okay. And this mindset again, the self-care, crew care, red zone care. The Gallup have been measuring engagement or discretionary effort for over 40 years, and they've now got down to just 12 statements. And one of those statements is, my supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. Not even does care, but seems to care about me as a person. And the more people that strongly agree with that statement, the higher the profit, productivity, customer service levels, and the longer people stay there. So we've come to the end of the presentation, and just welcome any questions you may have. I think Brandon had a couple that were already in. So what were they, Brandon?
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, so we've got some great questions that have come through. So the first one, as men, we struggle with friendships. Stuff gets in the way, and it's hard to make the time. What advice do you have for guys to make friends later in life?
Yeah, I have a number of rituals each week, and one of those on Sunday morning is that I meet two mates at Curl in the northern beaches of New South Wales, and we go for a walk up to Shelley Beach, just past Manly, come back and have breakfast. And it really works with three people because often one can't make it. Very, very rarely is that no one makes it, but it's a default in the diary. It doesn't happen every time, but probably happens 80% of the time. And I think that's a real element to realize, your one thing has got to be a priority. Reaching out and connecting and talking with others is a very important component. I had a walk again this morning with a friend, Richard Buller, who's the Chief Purpose Officer of KPMG. And it's in the diary. It happens. So that, as I said, it doesn't happen every time, but it happens more time than not. So I would, speak with your mates, set a time, and stick to it.
Hmm. Great, thank you, Graham. If I could just add to that too, I think another great thing is sort of finding common interest, like joining a group of some kind. It's a really good way to facilitate meeting new people if you don't already have existing friendships.
Uh,
That's also, yeah.
yeah, that's great. And I've got a suggestion on that. Like, there's a place called a website called Meetup, and you can put in there, your postcodes. It'll show all the groups that are getting together close to you. So you may find something that you're interested in, like fishing or, going to the football or whatever, but it's a way that you can find people with a common interest.
Thanks, Graham. So the next one, who do you go to if you don't have anyone you can trust or feel okay to be vulnerable around? I've felt judged in the past. Hmm.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And I felt like that as well before I had my breakdown. You might consider those three questions that I asked before and just say, who would help me if I lost a close family member? Who would I think of if I'm thinking about good advice? Um, that is certainly one thing and that might prompt some ideas. The second thing is some of those men's group that I mentioned, mentoring men, men's shed, um, dads in distress. They're they're led now by mentors that have been through what probably going through, and so exploring those groups I think is a very, very productive thing to do. If you happen to be handy, you go to the men's shed. I'm not so my equivalent of men's shed is an investment club that 13 guys have been part of for 25 years now. And, we've been through lots together. We get together once a month at someone's home. And 2 hours is, camaraderie and dinner, and about 45 minutes talking about investments. And yeah, I think that's to try and set up things like that to find like-minded people who've been through something like you're going through can be really helpful.
Thanks, Graham. The next one, I'm worried about the young men in my life. They seem increasingly isolated and really skeptical, hopeless about the world. What can we do as women to help support them and when they don't seem to want to connect with us?
Yeah, and the figures reflect that, a higher degree of depression and anxiety in men under 25 than just about every other demographic. If I think that the maybe the best thing would be to have them or ask them, who are some guys that you really relate to? Who are some guys that you've done something with in the past? Who are some guys that you went to school with? And I still have about three or four close friends that I went to school with. And that's a hint of, reconnecting with those people. They might feel embarrassed and might need a little bit of encouragement. Um, the other thing that I would suggest for women as well is to call Men's Line, um, or even and just ask them that question. What can I do to encourage this young guy to socialize more, not to be on his screen all the time, to exercise more? There's a very good website called Reach Out, and it's for younger people, designed for, like, 14 to 25. But they have a very good, family and parent section. And I would guess there'd be lots of other parents that would be experiencing that sort of thing. So going to those anonymous chat rooms and asking someone who's had the same situation, what did they find most helpful?
Thank you, Graham. That's some great resources. Um, we have lots more coming in, which is great. The next one is, what is the best way to break through the male mindset of I can handle this on my own? I don't want to bother anyone else with my problems.
Yeah, well, I talked about that before, this, I guess, conditioning, and it is conditioning to be, problem solving. That's, traditionally the view of, a male and a male's role. If you're if you're a male and you're trying to get another male to engage, I would, just sort of say, look, I notice you haven't been getting out much. Is ever anything happening? You don't seem yourself. Are you okay? And they may or may not embrace that and get onto it. But there's two other things then to follow is, to actually see or consider if you may know someone that has a closer, more trusting relationship with that person, and ask them to reach out to the young man you're concerned about. Um, and the other thing that I think can, be very good for a male to help another male open up is to share your own story, not to outgun them or say, "Oh, you think you got problems, want to hear about mine." But there is just really something quite extraordinary that happens when you share your story. It makes it safe for other people to share their story. Now, if it's a woman that's trying to help their son or help their husband or help a male friend do something, um, again, I would encourage you to think about, Men's Line and calling up that and asking, specific ideas that they may have to engage someone. It's always best, and men always react better to walking shoulder to shoulder than looking across, a coffee table in a cafe. And so just often to go for a walk together, you know, break the ice, just talk about life in general, general chit chat, and then just make an observation. Just I notice you haven't been yourself lately. You're normally not always on time, and you've been late a couple of times. Are you okay? Is everyone else okay? And again, there's a much greater chance of it happening if you're shoulder to shoulder than if you're, right opposite someone. So that would be my suggestion there.
Thank you, Graham. Okay, we've got quite a few more as well. So this one, how do we not overstep and make it worse as managers? I want to help, but I also don't want to cause harm.
Yeah.
It's a very good question.
A very, very good question. And we do feel that, you don't want to pry into someone's personal life, but work and home and life is so intertwined these days. We've got far more people working from home than ever before. And if someone is genuinely struggling and you reach out in the right way, they will appreciate it in most situations. Some might shut down, and that might mean, following up later to have a conversation. But they will appreciate, you reaching out, just trying to be understanding and just go into it with a real sense of credibility, not sorry, sorry, curiosity, and asking open-ended questions. Your goal is to help them feel understood. That only happens by asking questions. One of the people that I interviewed on the Caring CEO podcast, amazing leader called Bob Chapman. He wrote a book called Everybody Matters, and he grew his company from $20 million up to over $3 billion. And he said when he first started off, he thought it was things I had to do to show I cared. But what he really learned was that you show you care by listening with empathy. Listening with empathy so someone feels understood. And it is about asking those open-ended questions. It's being comfortable with this silence there. And I think also, being in the right environment also really helps as well.
Thank you. Another one is, how can female leaders support men in the workplace?
Yeah, another great question as well. It's funny, there's lots of, special interest groups now for all sorts of minorities in workplaces, and which has been a very, very positive thing. But there isn't a comparable thing for men to get together and discuss it. Um, you know, International Women's Day lasts a week, and there's like 30 events, and International Men's Day sort of passes by. Again, I think it is that real curiosity and asking, not to be accusing and saying, look, I'm just noticing you're not as productive as you were, or, you seem to be really stressed or whatever. But, again, asking the questions, the, the are you okay questions in different sort of formats. And there is likely to be one male in your group or your team that is very EQ and emotionally intelligent, aware. And I guess just reaching out to that person to see if they noticed the same thing as you did um, about that manager, and to see if they can reach out. I really believe in multiple approaches. There's an amazing real video on the Are You OK website. It's between Justin and Tom. Tom's the boss, working in the railways, very blokey industry. And, Justin talks about Tom asking him, are you okay? And he says, yeah, yeah, I'm fine. Asking again in a different environment, a different situation, yeah, I'm fine, no problem. And then finally, and Justin says this, when Tom asks for the sixth time, I just couldn't pretend anymore. So don't be afraid to revisit it if you're going back with, genuine concern and, for the right reason. You go with a spirit of care and to be in that present moment, and in that present moment to make that people feel like they're the most important person to you. And that comes through the listening with empathy.
Thank you. So we've got two more really good questions. How would you respond to the misconception of men's mental health or vulnerability as emasculating?
So if I'm understanding the question right, if you admit it, you're not a man. Is that what you think the crux of the question is, Brennan?
I'll just have a look here again. Um, maybe the person could expand a little bit too, maybe if they're still there.
Well, let me just comment on, being vulnerable, admitting that you're not coping, makes other men and perhaps women feel less of you. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that um, if you ask someone and they're not going well and you listen to them, you have made a huge impact on them. And vice versa, um, having other men that you can admit that you're not doing well makes a massive difference. I've mentioned a few times before this, before my breakdown, I felt that, I felt that it was weakness to admit that I wasn't coping and couldn't work things out. But, you know, remember that one lesson I had, the myth of, the successful one man, and, building those relationships and admitting that you're not coping and sharing what's happening with you. I can tell you from personal experience that, like, 90% of the time, that person will then talk about something that's happening with them, whether it's personally or with another male around them, sort of thing. When you share your story, your vulnerability gives permission for other people to do that as well.
Thanks, Graham. The person that asked questions said you got it. That was
All right.
exactly it. Thank you. We do have one more. We've just got some time. So men tend to be closed off after a certain life event or in grief. How do we support them to open up without being overbearing?
Mm. There are, lots of supports out there for grief. There's a grief line, for example. Um, but I think encouraging a catch up and to do something makes a big difference. Um, I was speaking to a friend of mine earlier on this week, and he and his mate both had a common mate that they were really concerned about. And this one they were concerned about, wife had just been diagnosed about 4 months ago with brain cancer. Very very poor recovery from anything like that. And what they decided to do was to go around to his place every Sunday and invite him out for a walk and to have breakfast. And that made it was no overnight success, but he did really appreciate it. And they do believe that there will be time when they will be able to discuss with him what happens when his wife dies, because it's the diagnosed very serious condition. So yeah, I think men can do that. I think also, women can do that as well. If it's a friend or whatever, just to try and set up something regular, because the more you meet, the better it is in terms of enjoying it. You've got a lot wider, much more history, a lot more background. It has to be consistent, and by consistent, I mean every week. Um, it can be less than, of course, but ideally, I think with someone you're concerned about, I think that's the right number. And then the third thing is just not to be judgmental when things are talked about. Just strive to help them feel understood. And if we help people feel understood, it dramatically increases the probability that you can influence them to do something, to see a doctor or what have you. If you can get them to fully disclose and to admit they're a bit lost, that's the right time to suggest seeking help.
Thank you, Graeme. Thank you. So we just have one other question, one last question. Um, so for workplace, sorry, I'm just having a look here. If a workplace is just starting to focus on mental health, where's the best place to begin?
The best place to begin is with managers. You've got to have an overarching plan, but the rubber really hits the road with managers, and managers that know, how to identify the early warning signs of people that hopefully can intervene early, or even better, to have a environment where people feel belonging and feel safe and feel that everyone has got their back. Gallup estimate that the impact of the manager on well-being and engagement is 70%. So it's a big factor there. And in my experience with Are You OK? I found that most people want to help but don't know how to help. And it's one of the reasons that I and another colleague founded WeCare 365. So we have scalable programs for managers that show them how to do this and have the conversations, intervene early, and have lots of supportive resources. We've done it with Fujitsu, trained every manager in Australia and in 9 countries in APAC, and with Aldi supermarkets, 2,500 of their managers. So being able to do it in a flexible way to learn the things they can do is really important. The second thing is for that managers can do is to lead a sustainable life, a healthy life in terms of getting exercise and making a difference. I once had a session with a big division of Macquarie Bank, and the head of that division, I talked about, the one thing that he really loved, and his one thing was running in the botanical gardens. And anyway, after the seminar, he started to do that every day, or most days. He'd leave at lunchtime, go for a run, come back. And the remarkable thing that happened was that other people, like his team, sort of who was doing, so they did their own version, going to a gym or, taking photos in the park but just having a break. So managers leading a life that walks the talk of well-being, but also having some easy skills to prevent or catch early issues before that little problem becomes a big one.
Thank you, Graeme. It's great advice for all the workplaces out there. I think we do have time for one more question. Um, in your experience, Graeme, what impact does sharing your story as a leader have on team culture and connection?
Profound,
Mm.
just profound. I shared the story of a session I was speaking at, but before it happened, the CEO of that division spoke. And he talked about, suddenly have to leave the family home, and he was homeless. He lived in a car for 2 or 3 days, and you could just see the room change. You could just see it change because he was someone, so on top of his game now and in great place. You could just see that transformation. I've also seen in the Department of Treasury in Canberra, where a very senior leader there, he was like a deputy secretary, one above the highest rung, shared his story of going through some really tough times and you know acknowledging people who'd reached out to him and even those who'd gone and got him a lunch because they noticed he wasn't eating and all this sort of stuff. It just is game changing, and just to show you that this isn't just about well-being. The best predictor of the most innovative and successful teams are those that have psychological safety. And psychological safety is where we can be our authentic selves. We can try new things. If they don't work out, we don't get crucified. We learn and move forward. And, you know, as a manager, I just really encourage asking these three questions. Do we feel connected? Do we feel that we belong? That's a fundamental human need. Second question is, do we feel safe? And this is psychological safety. And we want the outcome of that is we have each other's back. And the third question, do we share a future? And we want the outcome of that is that we thrive together. So, just shared on LinkedIn yesterday where I was interviewed by Sky News, and I talked about those three questions and the importance of creating an environment where people can be vulnerable, because Google and many, many others have found out that it's the number one predictor of their best teams.
Great. Thank you, Graeme. I think we actually do have one more question, which I think is a really good question to wrap things up and sort of actually expands on the sort of what you were just talking about. The question is, walking shoulder to shoulder is a great insight. Could you leave us with a mantra or phase which could help to frame us, get us into the mindset when aiming to address an issue?
Yeah, there's a Buddhist fable that I once heard, and it was about, a young princess who'd taken over the kingdom, and she asked advice. She wanted to build a really caring and resilient palace and kingdom, and she wasn't happy with the advice she got from her advisors. So she went out in disguise, went into, the rice paddies, the temples, the markets, suddenly had an epiphany. I've just got to answer three questions. So I'm just got to find the wisest person, climbs all the way up the Himalayas, finds the mystic monk, said, Father, I think I have to answer three questions to build a caring and resilient house, palace, empire. And he says, what are those three questions? And she says, question number one is, when is the most important time? Question number two is, who is the most important person? Question number three is, what is the most important thing to do? He says, congratulations, they are the right questions. I'll give you the answers. So the first one is, when's the most important time? Now, all of us know this intuitively, that it's now, but how much of our stress, burnout is being concerned about something in the future or regretful of something behind us? It's a big chunk. The second one is, who is the most important person? And I've talked about self-care isn't selfish. And so you might say, yeah, it's me. And that's a very, very good answer. But the mystic monk gave a nuanced answer. He said, the person you are with. So you're with that colleague, that friend, that uncle, and they are the most important person. And you show they're important by listening with empathy. And then the third question is, what is the most important thing to do? And the most important thing to do is to care for the person you're with. So, yeah, I just encourage you, every time you have one of those conversations, every time you're trying to navigate one of those different conversations, am I being present? Am I striving to be curious and to understand them? And am I showing care? And I show care after they feel understood. You might then recommend a course of action that might be helpful.
Great. Thanks again, Graeme. So I think that's all we have time for. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions. I think that facilitated some really great discussions. And thank you, Graeme, for taking us through your insights today. It's incredibly powerful to hear your story, how encouraging peer support groups, having open conversations, and fostering that culture of care you've shared can make a real tangible difference. Lastly, this is not just men's work. As we've discussed, everyone can play a significant role, whether as colleagues, leaders, friends, or partners. We encourage you to have regular check-ins and encourage open dialogue with the men in your lives. And for leaders, the opportunity is greater. Share your story, foster psychological safety in teams. Thank you, Graeme, again, for sharing your story and being part of today's session, and everyone listening in. Thank you and take care.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you.